Hello, everyone. Tonight, we journey back to a world where the simple act of raising a cup was woven into the very fabric of daily life. A world far removed from modern bars and buzzing nightlife. Imagine medieval villages and bustling taverns where people drank not just for pleasure, but for survival, for comfort, and sometimes for escape. In those times, water was often unsafe, and ale or mead was the trusted companion from dawn till dusk. But their drinking habits were strange to us now, filled with rituals, beliefs, and quirks that seem odd, even magical. From children sipping weak ale to monks quietly brewing their sacred potions, drinking was about more than just the liquid. It was about community, health, and even rebellion. Tonight, you'll hear about how ale shaped society, from the smallest peasant cottage to the grand halls of nobility. You'll discover the surprising ways people coped with hardship, celebrated joy, and sometimes drowned their fears. These are the weird, wonderful, and sometimes deeply human stories behind medieval drinking habits. Stories of tradition, necessity, and the power of connection over a shared cup. So settle in, take a slow breath, and let the voices of the past carry you gently into a world where every sip told a story and every drink held meaning beyond the taste. This is Weird Drinking Habits of Medieval People and More. Welcome to the journey. The morning ale ritual. Why breakfast started with beer. In the dawn of medieval Europe, before the sun had fully risen to warm the thatched roofs and cobbled streets, the day began with a ritual that might seem strange to us now. It was not the sharp bitterness of coffee, nor the gentle infusion of tea that stirred bodies awake. It was ale. Not the strong, amber ale of celebrations or feasts, but a much lighter brew, often called small beer. This ale was an everyday necessity, a drink woven into the fabric of life, especially at the very start of the day. To understand why ale was the morning drink of choice, we must first grasp the nature of medieval water. Unlike today, where purified water flows freely from taps, water in medieval times was a hazard. Wells, rivers, and streams were often contaminated with parasites, bacteria, and human waste. Drinking unboiled water could lead to deadly illnesses like dysentery, cholera, or typhoid fever. The simple act of drinking water was fraught with danger. It was not a safe option for most people. On the other hand, was safer. Brewing involved boiling the water with malted barley or wheat and then fermenting the mixture, a process that killed many harmful microorganisms. The alcohol content, though low in small beer, added another layer of protection. Thus, drinking ale was not just about taste or pleasure, it was a matter of survival. The brewing of ale was a daily task in most households, especially in rural villages. Women, who managed much of the household's food preparation, were usually responsible for brewing. Using simple tools, large wooden barrels, clay jugs, and woven baskets, they malted the grains, mashed them, boiled the wort, and left it to ferment with wild yeasts. This process, while seemingly basic, was a skill honed through generations, a craft passed down like a treasured heirloom. The morning ale, or small beer, was brewed to be weak, containing as little as 1 to 2% alcohol, making it safe for even children and the elderly to drink. It was nourishing, packed with calories and essential nutrients, providing energy and hydration. For the medieval peasant waking before sunrise to work the fields or tend to animals, this light ale was a vital part of their morning meal. Picture a typical peasant household as the first light filters through a small window. The kitchen is humble, a stone hearth, a wooden table scarred by years of use, simple stools worn smooth by generations. The mother stokes the embers, lifting a clay pot to warm the morning ale. The children, still sleepy-eyed, gather around, clutching small wooden or clay cups. The father, worn from years of labor, steps in from the cold morning air. Together, they drink quietly, the clinking of cups the only sound breaking the dawn's calm. This ritual was much more than a mere drink. It was a moment of comfort and community. The shared cup symbolized the family's resilience and unity. In a world of hardship and unpredictability, the morning ale was a small, steady comfort. Even in monasteries where monks lived apart from the villages, the morning ale was a staple. Brewing was a sacred art there, too. Monks followed strict recipes, refining their brews to support their ascetic lives. Fasting days required sustenance without solid food, and ale provided the needed calories and strength. These brews were sometimes called liquid bread, reflecting their importance to monastic nutrition. The social fabric of medieval life was interwoven with the culture of ale drinking. Taverns and alehouses served as gathering places, but the morning ale ritual was often private, shared within households. It marked the start of the day's labor, whether tilling fields, weaving cloth, or crafting tools, and provided a gentle wakefulness that sharpened the mind without dulling it. The taste of morning ale was distinct, slightly sour, lightly bitter, with the sweet warmth of malted grain. It was not meant to intoxicate, but to sustain. The brewing process left traces of the earth itself, the soil where barley grew, the water from village wells, and the yeast that floated invisibly in the air. Drinking this ale was a connection to the land and community. It's easy to forget how central this practice was to survival. In a time before refrigeration, antibiotics, or modern medicine, nourishment came in simple, repetitive acts, like the morning ale ritual. It was a daily medicine, a source of warmth against the cold, and a small pleasure amid toil. Through this lens, the morning cup of ale becomes a window into medieval life's deeper truths. It speaks of a people intimately tied to their environment, dependent on nature's rhythms, and rooted in community traditions. It reveals a society that found solace in routine, safety in shared habits, and hope in the smallest comforts. As the sun rose higher, the family would move on to their day's work, fields to till, looms to weave, goods to barter. But that first cup of ale remained with them, a liquid memory of home, health, and belonging. So when you think of medieval life, imagine not only castles and battles, but also this quiet morning ritual. Imagine the warmth of a simple drink that carried the weight of survival and the gentle promise of a new day. In that cup of ale, you hold a story of humanity, resilience, tradition, and the enduring power of connection. How alcohol became survival. In the medieval world, the threat of danger was often invisible. It lurked not only in the shadowed forests or on the battlefield, but in the very water people depended upon for life. Unlike our modern world, where clean, treated water is a given, medieval people faced the terrifying reality that their drinking water was often unsafe, carrying unseen enemies that could swiftly fell the strongest among them. This hidden peril shaped the habits and customs of an entire society, most notably their reliance on alcoholic beverages like ale and wine, not merely as indulgences, but as essential tools for survival. Water sources in medieval towns and villages came from wells, rivers, ponds, and springs, but they were vulnerable to contamination. Human and animal waste often seeped into groundwater, while surface water could be tainted by runoff from latrines, slaughterhouses, and market stalls. To the average medieval person, water was a gamble, a chance of life or sickness and death. Illnesses such as dysentery, cholera, typhoid fever, and other waterborne diseases were rampant, especially in crowded urban centers. When someone fell ill with a sudden and violent fever, few realized it was the very water they drank that betrayed them. In such a context, alcohol became more than a social lubricant or celebratory drink. It became a shield against disease. Ale, beer, and wine were all safer to consume because the processes used to produce them involved boiling and fermentation, both of which killed many harmful pathogens. These alcoholic beverages, even those with relatively low alcohol content, provided a far safer alternative to unboiled water. Ale, the most common drink for peasants and townsfolk alike, was often weak but constantly consumed throughout the day, especially the lighter small beer brewed for everyday drinking. Wine, more prevalent in southern Europe and favored by nobility, was similarly safer than water, but often saved for feasts and medicinal uses. Even mead and cider were popular in certain regions, each carrying with them the vital benefit of relative safety compared to untreated water. This reliance on alcohol shaped daily life profoundly. For the medieval working person, it was not unusual to consume several pints of small beer daily, morning, noon, and evening. This quantity might seem excessive today, but remember, this drink was their water. It provided hydration, calories, and nutrients in a form their bodies could safely process. It was common for children and the elderly to drink small beer precisely because it was a safer liquid than water, not because they sought intoxication. The health benefits of drinking fermented beverages in place of water are striking when understood in the medieval context. Though alcohol's antiseptic properties were not scientifically understood, practical knowledge passed down through generations ensured that ale was preferred over water. This custom likely saved countless lives, limiting outbreaks of deadly diseases tied to contaminated water sources. Monasteries, often centers of medical knowledge and brewing expertise, were especially mindful of water's dangers. Monks meticulously brewed ale and wine, both for sustenance and health. Their breweries were some of the most advanced in Europe, producing not just beverages for themselves, but also for their communities. Many believed that their brewed ale had curative powers, and it was frequently prescribed as part of monastic medicine. Yet, the importance of alcohol as a safer alternative to water was not without its challenges. The medieval mindset did not equate alcohol with mere intoxication, but with practicality. Drinking ale throughout the day was normal and necessary, but drunkenness was frowned upon. Temperance was expected, particularly among the working classes who needed their faculties sharp for labor. Interestingly, even during periods of water scarcity or drought, the brewing of ale often continued unabated, underscoring its critical role in daily life. Brewing was an agricultural extension, reliant on grains from the harvest, ensuring a steady supply of this essential beverage. The cycle of sowing, harvesting, malting, and brewing was interwoven with the very fabric of rural economies. This pervasive culture of drinking fermented beverages instead of water had broader social implications as well. Taverns and alehouses became important social hubs, not only places of relaxation and entertainment, but vital venues for sharing news and conducting business. In towns and cities, the sale of ale was tightly controlled by guilds and municipal authorities, highlighting its economic and social significance. We must also consider the spiritual dimension. Christian doctrine generally condemned drunkenness but permitted moderate drinking, especially of ale and wine, as part of everyday life and even religious ritual. The communion wine, for instance, was a sacred element, reinforcing the notion that alcohol was intertwined with both survival and spirituality. The daily reality was that water was often the enemy, and alcohol was an unexpected ally. This truth shaped not only health and diet, but the entire social fabric of medieval Europe. Understanding this helps us appreciate why the morning ale ritual was so vital, and why drinking habits were so different from today's expectations. In reflecting on this segment of medieval life, we see a people who adapted ingeniously to the environmental challenges they faced. Their drinking habits were practical responses to very real dangers, a testament to human resilience and the ability to find solutions in the face of adversity. Alcohol, brewed carefully and consumed mindfully, was a quiet hero of survival, sustaining bodies and communities alike. So, when we think about medieval drinking customs, we must look beyond the caricature of endless drunkenness. Instead, we see a nuanced world where ale and wine were lifelines, where survival depended on these humble fermented drinks, and where the simple act of raising a cup in the morning or afternoon was an act of care and protection. This understanding allows us to step closer to the lived experience of medieval people, a society navigating a harsh world where every habit, every tradition was shaped by the need to survive, to thrive, and to find moments of comfort in uncertain times. The story of medieval alcohol is not just a story of excess, but of necessity, wisdom, and the quiet power of tradition. Brewing ale at home, the quiet art of the alewife. In the heart of medieval villages, long before mass production or commercial breweries, the creation of ale was a deeply personal and essential craft, carried out quietly and skillfully within the humble walls of individual households. This craft was primarily the domain of women, known as alewives, whose role extended far beyond simple homemaking to being vital pillars of community health and economy. Brewing ale at home was not merely a chore, it was a respected and indispensable art woven into the rhythms of daily life and survival. The Elewife's day began early, often before dawn, in the cool, shadowed space of a small kitchen or dedicated brewhouse attached to the home. Here the tools of the trade awaited: wooden barrels and vats, large cauldrons for boiling, baskets for carrying malted grain, and simple clay jugs for storing the finished brew. The alewife was a master of this environment, skilled in the delicate balance of timing, temperature, and ingredients that transformed humble grains into the nourishing ale that sustained her family and neighbors. Brewing ale was a process passed down through generations, a blend of practical knowledge and tradition. Barley, the staple grain, had to be malted first, soaked in water to encourage germination, then dried over a fire. This malted grain was then ground and mashed to extract the sugary wort, which was boiled in water, often with the addition of herbs or other flavorings to improve taste and preserve the liquid. Wild yeast in the air, or sometimes intentionally captured starter cultures, fermented the wort into ale over days or weeks. Ale brewed at home varied in strength and flavor according to the season, the skill of the alewife, and the resources available. Small beer, the weak ale consumed daily, required less malt and shorter fermentation, making it a lighter, safer drink. Stronger ales were reserved for special occasions or for guests. The alewife's craft was vital. A poorly brewed batch could spoil quickly, risking sickness and wasting precious resources. This craft was not solitary. While the alewife managed much of the brewing herself, her role connected her to wider village life. Ale was often shared, traded, or sold, making her a small-scale entrepreneur within her community. The quality of her ale contributed to her family's reputation and economic stability. Her knowledge was respected. Many alewives became sources of advice on brewing and health, and sometimes even midwives or healers, as ale was also used medicinally. The quiet art of ale brewing was, in fact, a cornerstone of medieval nutrition and culture. In an age when food preservation was challenging and fresh bread was not always available, ale was a vital source of calories and hydration. It was sometimes called liquid bread, reflecting its importance as a dietary staple. For many, especially the poor and working class, it provided a steady supply of nutrients needed to endure long hours of labor. The alewife's work was physically demanding and required keen attention to detail. Timing was everything, from the precise moment the grains were malted to the duration of fermentation. Temperature control was crude but crucial, managed by adjusting the heat of the hearth fire or moving barrels to different parts of the house. The alewife's senses, smell, sight, touch, were finely tuned to detect subtle changes indicating when the ale was ready or spoiled. Brewing was also intertwined with the rhythms of the agricultural calendar. Spring and autumn were common brewing seasons, following the harvest of barley. This cyclical nature connected the alewife's craft directly to the land and seasons, reinforcing a deep relationship between people and their environment. Beyond the practical, ale brewing held social and cultural significance. It was often tied to local festivals, religious observances, and community gatherings. The sharing of ale was a gesture of hospitality, friendship, and trust. In this, the alewife was a guardian of tradition and social cohesion, her craft fostering connection in a world that could otherwise be harsh and isolating. Yet this vital role was not without challenges. Brewing required time, effort, and resources, commodities not always readily available, especially in times of hardship or poor harvest. The alewife had to balance her brewing duties with other household tasks, childcare, and sometimes agricultural labor. Despite these burdens, her work remained central to her family's well-being. Over time, as towns grew and commerce expanded, some alewives began to operate small taverns or alehouses from their homes, selling their brew to neighbors and travelers. This shift brought both opportunity and scrutiny. Local authorities regulated brewing and ale sales closely, concerned with quality, taxation, and public order. Alewives navigated this complex world with resilience and resourcefulness. The art of home brewing, carried out largely by women, shaped the very character of medieval drinking culture. It was a practice born from necessity, refined by tradition, and imbued with care and community spirit. Through the alewife's skillful hands, humble ingredients became a life-sustaining elixir, nourishing bodies and nurturing bonds. When we imagine the medieval world, it is easy to picture grand castles or battles, but the quiet, smoky kitchens where alewives brewed their daily batches tell a more intimate story. It is in these spaces, filled with the warmth of hearth fires and the scent of malt and hops, that the heart of medieval life beat strongest. The alewife's craft, passed from mother to daughter, was a gift of survival and celebration, a tradition that connected past and present, linking us across centuries through the shared human experience of food, drink, and community. It reminds us that even in the simplest acts, there is profound meaning. So, as you envision that small wooden house, the bubbling cauldron, and the patient hands stirring the brew, remember the alewife, the quiet artist whose work sustained a world, one batch at a time. Taverns and inns, where everyone knew your name and your cup. In medieval Europe, taverns and inns were far more than mere places to drink. They were the pulsating social centers of towns and villages, the crossroads where the lives of peasants, merchants, travelers, and even nobles briefly intertwined. These establishments, often modest wooden or stone buildings with smoky hearths and low ceilings, were sanctuaries of camaraderie and community in a world that was otherwise often isolating and harsh. The strange, rich tapestry of drinking habits, customs, and etiquette found here tells a vivid story of human connection, survival, and tradition. From the outside, a tavern or inn might seem unremarkable, no grand facade or elaborate sign. Yet within, a unique and familiar world awaited those who crossed the threshold. The tavern was a place where everyone knew your name, where your favorite cup or mug was remembered, and where the pouring of ale and wine followed rituals as old as the streets themselves. It was where strangers became neighbors, gossip flowed as freely as the drinks, and the concerns of the day were laid bare and shared. Ale and wine were the staples of these gatherings, with small beer quenching thirsts and stronger brews marking celebrations or late-night conversations. The alehouse was the domain of the common folk, while inns catered more often to travelers and merchants needing food and lodging alongside their drink. Yet both served as vital centers of exchange, not just of drink, but of news, ideas, and social bonds. The atmosphere inside was dense with smoke from the hearth fire, the warm glow of flickering candles, and the constant murmur of voices, laughter, and the occasional song or tale. Wooden benches and long tables bore the marks of countless gatherings, their surfaces polished smooth by years of elbows and mugs. Each tavern had its own character, shaped by the patrons who frequented it and the alewives and innkeepers who tended it. These places were more than social hubs, they were vital to the local economy. Ale and wine sales were carefully regulated by guilds and local authorities who issued licenses and inspected the quality of brews. Taverns were taxed, and their profits often contributed to the town's coffers. This relationship between drink and governance was complex. Authorities sought to maintain order while also profiting from the sale of alcohol. Customs surrounding drinking in taverns were layered with meaning. It was common practice to share mugs or cups, a gesture that fostered trust but also demanded cleanliness, though the standards were vastly different from today's. Pledging your cup or drinking from another's was a ritual of fellowship, binding people together in a shared moment. The clink of mugs, the hearty cheers, and the exchange of stories were all parts of this dance. Yet taverns were not without their dangers. Excessive drinking and brawls were feared by both authorities and patrons. Drunkenness could lead to disorder, accidents, or worse, being thrown into the stocks or jailed. As such, many inns and taverns had strict rules or curfews. The innkeeper, often a shrewd and sometimes stern figure, balanced hospitality with the need to keep peace. The social stratification of medieval society was reflected within these walls. Nobles and clergy rarely entered common taverns, but inns and alehouses occasionally welcomed a range of patrons. Travelers brought news from distant lands, merchants conducted informal business deals, and villagers found respite from their daily toil. In this melting pot, the exchange of information was constant and crucial. Alcohol itself was a topic of folklore and superstition in these establishments. Many believed that ale had healing powers, that a well-brewed cup could lift spirits, ease aches, and even ward off evil. Alewives and innkeepers sometimes doubled as informal healers or advisors, offering remedies brewed alongside their drinks. The line between medicine and merriment was often blurred. The architecture of taverns and inns contributed to their atmosphere. Thick walls insulated against cold winds, while low beams and narrow windows created cozy, intimate spaces. Large open hearths were central, providing warmth and a place to cook simple meals. The mingled aromas of burning wood, malt, herbs, and cooking food formed a distinctive sensory backdrop, comforting in its familiarity. It was in these taverns that the peculiarities of medieval drinking culture came alive. The use of communal cups, the mixing of ale with spices or honey, the ritual of toasting the health of the king or local lord. These habits were not simply frivolous, but deeply embedded in the social fabric, reinforcing identity, allegiance, and community bonds. Stories shared in taverns often traveled far beyond their walls. A humorous tale, a tragic account, or a whispered secret could spread quickly, gaining new details with each retelling. This oral culture was vital in a largely illiterate society and served as a mechanism for preserving history, shaping opinions, and warning against dangers. Despite the conviviality, taverns were also places of solitude for many. The weary laborer nursing a single cup, the traveler seeking a quiet corner, or the loner contemplating life, all found refuge within these walls. The tavern was a mirror of medieval society, its joys, its struggles, its complexities. Understanding the role of taverns and inns reveals much about the medieval world's social and cultural life. These were places where drinking was both a practical necessity and a rich tradition, where human connection was forged over shared cups and stories, and where the rhythms of daily life found expression in the rise and fall of laughter, song, and silence. So as you imagine stepping into a medieval tavern, feel the warmth of the hearth, hear the murmur of voices, and see the flicker of candlelight playing over faces worn by hardship and hope alike. Here, in these humble spaces, the strange and wonderful drinking habits of medieval people come vividly alive, reminding us that history is not just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry of human experience, rich with flavor, spirit, and life. Church wine and sacred spirits. Drinking in the house of God. In medieval Europe, the line between the sacred and the everyday was often blurred, especially when it came to alcohol. While taverns and inns were places of social gathering and secular merriment, the church introduced a different dimension to drinking, one imbued with spiritual meaning, ritual significance, and divine symbolism. Understanding the role of wine and other sacred spirits in religious life offers a fascinating glimpse into how medieval people perceived alcohol not only as a worldly pleasure, but as a conduit of the divine. Church wine was central to the Christian liturgy, especially in the celebration of the Mass. For medieval worshippers, the ritual of communion was both a profound mystery and a vital part of their spiritual lives. The wine consecrated by the priest was believed to become the blood of Christ, a sacred transformation called transubstantiation. This belief infused the wine with a sanctity that transcended its earthly origins, making it far more than just a drink. Unlike the ale and mead consumed in daily life, church wine was carefully produced, stored, and handled with reverence. Monasteries and cathedral precincts often maintained vineyards or procured the finest wines from southern Europe, particularly from regions like Burgundy or the Rhineland. The monks, who were among the most skilled brewers and vintners of their day, took great care in producing wines that would meet the exacting standards of the church. In the dimly lit stone chapels and grand cathedrals, The aroma of incense mingled with the subtle scent of the wine, creating a sensory atmosphere thick with solemnity and reverence. The chalice, often ornately decorated with gold and precious stones, was raised high by the priest, catching flickering candlelight as the congregation bowed their heads in silent worship. But the church's relationship with alcohol was not confined solely to the sacramental wine. Throughout the medieval period, sacred spirits and medicinal brews played a role in religious communities' daily lives. Monasteries, in particular, were centers of both spiritual devotion and practical knowledge. Monks cultivated herbs, brewed medicinal ales, and distilled early forms of spirits used for healing as much as for contemplation. These sacred brews were carefully formulated and sometimes infused with symbolic meaning. Certain herbs and spices were believed to possess protective or purifying properties, echoing the spiritual purification sought in the monastic life. Drinking these potions was an act of faith and healing, bridging the physical and the metaphysical worlds. The consumption of alcohol within the church's walls was not without its rules and challenges. While the Mass required wine for the Eucharist, excessive drinking or drunkenness was condemned by religious authorities. Monastic rules, such as the Rule of St. Benedict, included strict guidelines on temperance, discipline, and moderation. The ideal was a sober mind dedicated to prayer and work, with alcohol used only as a tool for health or ritual. Yet the reality was often more complicated. Medieval monks were human, after all, and occasional overindulgence is recorded in some chronicles and anecdotes. However, the overarching expectation was that alcohol, when used, should serve a higher purpose, whether spiritual or medicinal, and never devolve into excess. Beyond the monastery, church festivals and holy days frequently featured wine and ale as part of communal celebrations. These occasions blurred the lines between the sacred and the secular, bringing people together in shared joy and religious devotion. The consumption of alcohol on these days was often seen as a blessing, a communal act of thanksgiving, and a reaffirmation of social bonds under God's watchful gaze. This sacred drinking culture also shaped attitudes toward alcohol consumption more broadly. The church's influence permeated social norms, encouraging moderation, while acknowledging the importance of wine as a symbol of divine grace and human fellowship. It provided a moral framework that guided medieval people in balancing pleasure, health, and piety. To step into a medieval church and witness the use of wine there is to glimpse a world where every sip was laden with meaning. The sacred wine was not simply a drink, it was a vessel of faith, a sign of the covenant between humanity and the divine, and a tangible connection to the mysteries of salvation. In the hushed reverence of the Mass, the wine carried the prayers and hopes of the faithful, uniting them across time and space. It was a ritual that transcended ordinary life, reminding medieval people that even in a world of hardship and uncertainty, there existed moments of sacred grace, where heaven and earth touched through the simple act of drinking wine. And so, the story of church wine and sacred spirits reveals the profound spiritual dimension of medieval drinking habits, where alcohol was not only a practical necessity or social lubricant, but also a sacred element, woven into the fabric of faith, healing, and community. Monks who brewed, holy men, hops, and hidden drunkenness. Monasteries were among the most remarkable institutions of medieval Europe, serving as centers of spirituality, learning, and culture. But perhaps one of their lesser-known roles was that of the brewer. Monks, cloistered away from the bustling villages and towns, cultivated a quiet and profound mastery of the brewing craft. Their contributions to the world of beer were vast, both in refining the art and in preserving its knowledge through turbulent times. Yet behind this sacred craft, there lay a paradox. Holy men who brewed with devotion and yet sometimes wrestled with the temptations of drink themselves. Brewing was an essential part of monastic life. Water was often unsafe to drink, and ale offered a nutritious, safer alternative, especially during the long hours of prayer and labor. Monks brewed ale not only for their own sustenance, but also to provide for pilgrims, travelers, and the poor. The brewing process itself was meticulous, blending knowledge of grains, yeast, herbs, and later hops, a bittering agent that monks helped popularize. This ingredient not only improved flavor but also acted as a preservative, enabling the ale to last longer. The brewing halls in monasteries were places of both science and devotion. The monks treated their work as an extension of their spiritual discipline. Precision, patience, and care were paramount. Recipes were recorded and passed down, often guarded as valuable secrets. The abbeys of Europe became famed for their distinct brews, some still celebrated today as Trappist ales, carrying centuries of monastic tradition. Yet, alongside the holiness and industry, there were moments of contradiction. Despite vows of temperance, some monks struggled with overindulgence. Historical records and occasional chronicles hint at episodes of hidden drunkenness, secret parties, and disputes sparked by excessive drinking within monastic walls. These moments remind us that monks were human, grappling with the same desires and weaknesses as anyone else. Monastic authorities attempted to regulate drinking through rules and edicts. The rule of Saint Benedict, foundational to Western monasticism, prescribed moderation, emphasizing sobriety as essential to maintaining the mind's clarity and the body's health. Drinking was allowed, but always in measured amounts, often accompanied by spiritual reflection or communal meals. Monks' brewing knowledge and the resulting ales had profound social impact beyond their cloisters. They set brewing standards that influenced lay brewers and shaped the medieval beer market. Monastic ales were prized for their quality and were traded or gifted to nobility and clergy alike. In times of famine or hardship, monastic breweries helped stabilize local supplies, their cellars stocked with ale that provided nourishment and comfort. The paradox of monastic brewing, between sacred labor and human frailty, adds rich texture to our understanding of medieval drinking habits. It was a world where devotion and daily life entwined, where the cup could be both a symbol of spiritual sustenance and a source of temptation. Imagining the monks at work brings to life the slow rhythms of medieval monastic life. From the dawn prayers to the evening vespers, the quiet bubbling of fermenting barrels, the careful weighing of malt, and the sharing of a modest cup after a long day's work, all reflect a unique blend of faith and craft. Thus, the story of monks who brewed is not just about beer. It is about the human condition in a world shaped by faith, discipline, and the simple, enduring pleasures of the table. It reminds us that even within the sacred, the earthy realities of life and struggle remain ever present. The communal cup, why sharing your drink meant trust. In the medieval world, where life was often precarious and trust scarce, sharing a drink was more than a simple act of conviviality. It was a profound gesture of trust and social bonding. The communal cup, passed from hand to hand, held a deep symbolism that transcended the mere consumption of ale or wine. It was a ritual that spoke of loyalty, friendship, and mutual reliance in a society where alliances could mean the difference between survival and ruin. Unlike the individual bottles and mugs of modern times, medieval drinking often took place from shared vessels. Large wooden or metal cups, sometimes ornately carved or decorated, were common in taverns, great halls, and even humble homes. These cups might hold ale, mead, or wine, and were passed around a group, each person drinking their fill before passing it along. This practice was not without risk. Disease was real and ever present, but the social importance outweighed the dangers. The communal cup embodied the idea of fellowship. To share from the same vessel was to acknowledge membership in a social circle, whether family, village, guild, or military unit. It was a sign that all present were bound by a certain code of honor and trustworthiness. To refuse the cup could be interpreted as an insult or a rejection of the group's solidarity, potentially isolating the individual. In noble courts and knightly gatherings, the passing of the communal cup was often steeped in ceremony. Rituals around drinking could reinforce oaths, celebrate victories, or mark solemn occasions. The cup itself might be a treasured heirloom, passed down through generations, its use marking continuity and tradition. Drinking from it was an act of respect, not just for the present company, but for the ancestors and values they upheld. In the rougher settings of medieval taverns, the communal cup served a practical purpose. Large groups of travelers or laborers might share from it and serve precious ale or wine. Yet even here, the practice created bonds, momentarily uniting strangers in a shared experience. Stories were told, songs sung, and plans forged over the passing of the cup. Beyond social bonding, the communal cup had a spiritual dimension as well. At religious festivals or feasts, shared drinking symbolized unity under God, a physical manifestation of communal grace. It echoed the Christian rite of communion, where sharing the cup of wine signified participation in the body of Christ. This sacred association lent the communal cup an added weight in medieval minds, blending the secular and the sacred. The risks of disease transmission were known to some extent, but the medieval understanding of contagion was limited. Trust in the group's health and honor often outweighed fears of illness. Sharing the cup was also a test of trustworthiness. Anyone harboring ill intent, such as poisoning, was betraying the fundamental social contract. Hence, the communal cup was both a symbol and a safeguard of mutual respect. Interestingly, some medieval accounts and legal codes even included punishments for those who violated communal drinking trust, whether through poisoning or refusing the cup when social norms demanded acceptance. The shared cup was a small but powerful institution that upheld social cohesion in an uncertain world. Imagining a medieval gathering, one can see the worn wooden table, the flickering light of candles, and the circle of faces, young and old, noble and commoner, all connected by the simple act of passing the cup. The sound of laughter mingles with the clinking of mugs, the murmur of stories shared across time and circumstance. Each sip is more than refreshment. It is an affirmation of trust, belonging, and shared humanity. This practice of communal drinking invites us to reflect on the deep human need for connection, especially in times and places where survival depended on solidarity. It reminds us that behind many strange or unfamiliar medieval habits lies a timeless desire to belong, to trust, and to find community in the company of others. When everyone got a little too Bailey hardship. Medieval feast days were moments of communal celebration, marked by ritual, joy, and an abundance of food and drink that temporarily lifted the burdens of daily hardship. These festive occasions, often tied to religious holidays, seasonal cycles, or local traditions, were highlights of the year when villages, towns, and noble courts alike threw open their doors to revelry. Yet amid the singing, dancing, and feasting, the drinking habits of medieval people often tipped into what might today be called frenzied excess. Moments when everyone, from peasants to lords, got a little too merry. Feast days were deeply embedded in medieval culture. The church calendar provided a steady rhythm of celebrations, from Christmas and Easter to saints' days and harvest festivals. Each feast was an opportunity to gather, reaffirm community ties, and honor both the divine and the earth's bounty. The preparation was elaborate. Meats roasted whole, loaves baked, spiced wines brewed, and barrels of ale emptied. Drinking on these occasions was both a necessity and a tradition. Ale and wine flowed freely, often stronger than the everyday versions, spiked with herbs and spices to enliven the palate. The sheer quantity consumed could be staggering. Stories from chronicles and court records describe how entire villages would drink until their senses blurred, their laughter echoing through the night. These feast day frenzies were not without consequence. While some drank to toast health and fortune, others overindulged, slipping into drunkenness that led to quarrels, injuries, and sometimes more tragic outcomes. Laws and church edicts frequently warned against excessive drinking, urging moderation even during celebrations. Yet the allure of release from toil and sorrow proved irresistible. In noble courts, feasts were often theatrical affairs, complete with minstrels, jesters, and elaborate ceremonies. Drinking here carried social meaning. It was a sign of generosity and status, a way to cement alliances or display wealth. But even nobles were not immune to the excesses. and many a chronicler noted the reckless behavior of the elite after too many cups. Among common folk, the feast day frenzy took on a communal spirit, a collective shedding of daily worries. Alehouses and village greens became stages for boisterous dancing, singing, and storytelling. The communal cup made its rounds, reinforcing bonds even as inhibitions waned. This mixture of joy and chaos was part of the feast's enduring appeal. Religious festivals added an ironic twist to these frenzies. While feasts honored saints or holy days, the drinking often bordered on the profane. Church leaders preached sobriety, but recognized that celebration was a human need. Some monasteries and churches even brewed their own ale for distribution during festivals, blending piety and pleasure in curious ways. The physical effects of feast day drinking were well known. Medieval medical texts advised on remedies for hangovers, herbal concoctions, and restorative broths. But beyond the body, the social impact was significant. Feast day excesses could spark feuds, disrupt markets, or lead to law enforcement crackdowns. At the same time, they provided an outlet for expression, release, and communal joy essential to medieval life. To imagine a medieval feast day frenzy is to picture a swirl of color and sound. Long tables groaning with food, candles flickering against stone walls, voices raised in song and laughter, the steady clink of tankards passed from hand to hand. Beneath the surface of this celebration lies a complex dance of social order and chaos, faith and folly, tradition and human desire. These moments of collective merriment reveal much about medieval attitudes toward drinking. They show a world where alcohol was both a sacred gift and a dangerous temptation, where community was forged in shared joy but tested by excess. The feast day frenzy remains a vivid reminder that even in the strictest times, the human spirit craves celebration and sometimes gets carried away. The golden honey drink that once stirred the hearts and imaginations of medieval people was more than just a beverage. It was a potion woven into the fabric of myth, legend, and ritual. Long before wine and ale dominated tavern tables, mead held a special place in the medieval palate, celebrated not only for its sweetness, but for its mystical associations and revered status as the nectar of the gods. The making of mead was an art as old as civilization itself. Crafted from fermented honey, water, and occasionally flavored with herbs and spices, mead required patience and skill. The fermentation process was slower and more delicate than brewing ale, and the result was a drink often richer, stronger, and sweeter. In a world where sugar was scarce and precious, mead's honey taste was a rare luxury that carried with it a sense of magic and delight. Medieval lore imbued mead with almost supernatural qualities. It was often linked to the divine, associated with feasting gods and heroic warriors in Norse and Celtic traditions. The mead of poetry, a mythical brew granting wisdom and eloquence, was said to inspire bards and kings alike. These stories were passed down through generations, intertwining mead with the cultural and spiritual life of medieval peoples. In practical terms, mead's popularity waxed and waned across regions and classes. In Northern Europe, where wild honey was abundant, mead was a staple at celebrations, weddings, and religious festivals. Nobles prized it for its sweetness and rarity, while peasants might taste it only on special occasions. Monasteries sometimes produced mead, though their brewing was more commonly focused on ale and wine. The symbolism of mead extended beyond mere consumption. It was often served in ornate drinking horns or finely crafted cups, reflecting its elevated status. The act of sharing mead in ceremonial context was a gesture of honor and unity, a way to seal alliances or celebrate victories. Mead halls, where warriors gathered to drink and tell tales, were legendary centers of social life and storytelling, immortalized in epics and sagas. Yet, like all alcoholic beverages of the time, mead was a double-edged sword. Its sweetness could mask its potency, and overindulgence sometimes led to the same excesses seen in ale or wine drinking. Still, mead retained a certain mystique, a connection to a world where the boundary between the natural and supernatural was porous, and every sip was steeped in history and myth. To imagine the medieval mead experience is to see a dimly lit hall filled with the warmth of hearth fire, the hum of voices recounting ancient tales, and the gleam of golden liquid raised in toast. It is a sensory journey, sweet, heady, and intoxicating, an invitation to partake in a tradition that bridged the earthly and the divine. Through mead, we glimpse a medieval world where drinking was never just about thirst or pleasure, but about connection to nature, to community, and to the stories that shape their very identity. Mead remains a testament to the enduring power of ritual and the human desire to find magic in the everyday. Ale versus beer, the battle of the brews. In the bustling taverns and humble kitchens of medieval Europe, a quiet yet persistent rivalry simmered, one that would shape the drinking culture for centuries to come. This was the ongoing debate between ale and beer, two brews often used interchangeably today, but distinct in their medieval origins, ingredients, and cultural significance. To understand the battle of the brews is to appreciate not only the technical craft of fermentation, but the social and regional nuances that defined medieval drinking habits. Ale, the older of the two, was a staple of medieval life long before hops became widespread in brewing. Made from malted barley and fermented with wild yeasts or cultivated strains, ale was traditionally unhopped, which made it sweeter, fuller-bodied, and more prone to spoilage. It was brewed close to home, often by women known as alewives, who passed down recipes through generations. Ale's lack of bitterness meant it was easier to drink, especially for those unaccustomed to strong flavors. Beer, by contrast, introduced hops as a key ingredient, a bittering agent that not only added distinctive flavor, but acted as a preservative. This innovation, which arrived from Central Europe around the 12th or 13th century, gradually transformed brewing practices. Hopped beer lasted longer, could be stored and transported farther, and developed a sharper, more complex taste profile. Yet its introduction met resistance, especially in regions where ale had been the customary drink for centuries. The distinction was more than just botanical. Ale was often associated with the rural, the domestic, and the traditional, while beer came to symbolize commercial brewing, urban markets, and innovation. In England, for example, ale dominated until the 15th century, when hopped beer began to gain favor, partly due to increasing trade with continental Europe. Brewers and consumers found themselves navigating a cultural crossroads, balancing respect for time-honored customs with the allure of new flavors and longer shelf life. This battle also reflected social divisions. Ale houses were community hubs where neighbors gathered, shared news, and bonded. The taste of ale was comforting and familiar, a liquid thread connecting families and villages. Beer, with its sharper taste and longer reach, became a product of emerging trade networks in expanding cities. The rise of beer breweries paralleled the growth of towns and the increasing commercialization of daily life. The brewing processes themselves were a study in contrast. Ale required careful timing, attentive brewing, and immediate consumption. Its short shelf life meant it was often consumed, fresh and locally. Beer, with hops' preservative qualities, could be brewed in larger batches and shipped over distances, allowing brewers to reach wider markets. This shift helped lay the foundation for the complex beer cultures that would flourish in later centuries. Medieval records reveal debates, regulations, and preferences surrounding these brews. Tax laws sometimes differentiated ale from beer, and guilds guarded brewing secrets jealously. Patrons voiced their tastes in taverns and courts, where the quality and style of a drink could reflect status and identity. Some chroniclers even lamented the loss of pure ale as beer's popularity grew, viewing it as a change in tradition. Yet both ale and beer coexisted for centuries, each fulfilling needs and desires within medieval society. Their battle was less about outright victory and more about adaptation, innovation, and cultural exchange. Together, they illustrate the rich tapestry of medieval life, where even something as simple as a drink was bound up in history, geography, and community. To imagine this story is to see medieval brewers, hands stained with malt and hops, navigating ancient recipes and new techniques. It is to hear the hum of taverns filled with lively debate, to smell the sweet and bitter aromas mingling in the air, and to taste the evolving legacy of medieval fermentation, a legacy still alive in every pint poured today. In medieval towns and villages across Europe, drinking was far more than a simple act of refreshment or socializing. It was a practice deeply intertwined with daily life, economy, and even public health. But with the widespread consumption of ale and beer came a pressing question. How could one be sure that the drinks served were pure, safe, and fairly measured? This is where the fascinating figure of the ale conner emerged, a medieval drink inspector charged with guarding the quality and honesty of the brews that filled the cups of common folk and nobles alike. Ale conners were officials appointed by local authorities to inspect alehouses, taverns, and breweries, ensuring that brewers and cellars adhered to established standards. Their role was vital in a time when regulation was sparse and the potential for fraud or contamination was high. Given the essential place of ale and beer in daily nutrition, safeguarding its quality was not merely a matter of commerce, but one of communal welfare. The origins of ale conners can be traced back to early medieval England, where the position became formalized under royal and municipal law. The ale conner's duties included tasting the ale to judge its flavor, strength, and cleanliness, inspecting the equipment used in brewing, and checking measures to prevent shortchanging customers. These inspectors were sometimes accompanied by sworn juries of townsfolk who supported their verdicts and upheld the law. Their work was far from easy. The ale conner had to distinguish between genuine defects, such as sourness, excessive bitterness, or dilution, and minor variations inherent in the brewing process. They also faced resistance from brewers and tavern owners who might view their inspections as an intrusion or a threat to profit. Yet their authority was backed by law, and penalties for selling bad or watered-down ale could be severe, including fines, confiscation of goods, or even public humiliation. Interestingly, ale conners were often respected figures within their communities, combining knowledge of brewing with a sense of civic duty. They were expected to possess a refined palate and a strong understanding of the brewing craft, making their judgments trustworthy. Their presence reassured drinkers that the alehouse offered a fair and safe product, building trust in an age before modern food and drink regulations. The role of the ale conner also intersected with wider concerns about public morality and social order. Excessive drinking was a worry for medieval authorities, who sometimes saw alehouses as hotbeds of disorder or vice. By regulating the quality and quantity of ale conners contributed to a delicate balance, allowing people to enjoy their customary drink while curbing abuses and maintaining community standards. Their inspections were often part of annual or seasonal fairs, marked by official ceremonies and local gatherings. These events combined the practical with the festive, as communities came together to celebrate their produce and hold brewers accountable. The ale conner's verdict might be recorded in town records, serving as a mark of quality and reputation for years to come. Ale conners were not unique to England. Similar roles existed across medieval Europe under various names, reflecting the universal importance of brewing in medieval economies and cultures. Whether called beermeisters in German towns or bierers in France, these inspectors formed an essential link between producers, consumers, and governing authorities. To imagine the ale conner's world is to step into bustling medieval streets, filled with the clatter of barrels and the murmur of tavern patrons. It is to see a figure with a discerning eye and a steady hand, carefully sampling a frothy cup of ale, making judgments that could affect livelihoods and reputations. It is to understand how even the simplest pleasures, like a pint of ale, were governed by systems designed to protect the community and uphold trust. Through their vigilance and expertise, ale conners helped ensure that medieval drinking remained not only a source of comfort and camaraderie, but a practice grounded in fairness and quality. Their legacy echoes in today's standards of food safety and consumer protection, reminding us that behind every drink lies a history of care, regulation, and responsibility. Drinking songs, melodies that gently slurred at night. In the dim light of medieval taverns and village halls, as the day's labors gave way to the warm glow of flickering candles and hearth fires, another ritual began to unfold, the singing of drinking songs. These melodies, simple yet stirring, wove their way through the air like threads of communal joy, binding drinkers together in shared stories, laughter, and occasional slurred confessions. The drinking song was more than mere entertainment. It was a social glue, a gentle release from the harshness of daily toil, and an audible expression of medieval culture's complex relationship with alcohol. Unlike today's carefully composed and commercially polished tunes, medieval drinking songs were often passed down orally, their verses adapting with each telling. They ranged from bawdy and humorous to solemn and reflective, sometimes celebrating the virtues of ale and wine, at other times warning of the perils of overindulgence. These songs were communal property, a living tradition shaped by singers, listeners, and the rhythms of village life. At the heart of the drinking song was its ability to invite participation. The repetitive choruses and straightforward melodies allowed even the most inexperienced singers to join in. This inclusivity was essential in a time when literacy was limited, and music was a communal language accessible to all. The songs often told stories of love, loss, heroic feats, or comic mishaps, all framed within the convivial atmosphere of drink. Scholars have traced many of these melodies to popular medieval ballads and folk tunes, indicating that drinking songs were deeply intertwined with broader cultural expressions. Instruments like the lute, hurdy-gurdy, and pipe often accompanied the singing, adding texture and rhythm. In taverns and inns, minstrels or troubadours sometimes performed more elaborate versions, blending entertainment with social commentary. Drinking songs also served a psychological purpose. The act of singing together created a sense of unity and release, easing the burdens of hard labor and social hierarchy. In the rigid social structure of medieval Europe, where daily life was often marked by hardship and strict roles, singing was a momentary liberation. Even the most humble peasants could find joy and camaraderie through shared song and drink. Yet these songs were not without caution. Many contained embedded moral lessons, reminding listeners of the dangers of excessive drinking, the fickleness of fortune, and the need for temperance. They reflected a medieval worldview that recognized pleasure and excess as intertwined, where merriment could quickly tip into chaos or sorrow. The slurred words and laughter that filled taverns were thus part celebration, part acknowledgement of human frailty. In some regions, drinking songs had ritualistic significance, performed during festivals, harvest celebrations, or religious holidays. They marked transitions in the calendar, binding communities through shared tradition. The songs would often crescendo in volume and enthusiasm as night deepened, voices growing louder and less restrained, creating a collective euphoria tempered by the awareness of dawn's inevitable return. For medieval women, participation in drinking songs was complex. While alewives and women in taverns often led or joined in singing, social norms sometimes restricted women's roles in public entertainment. Nonetheless, many songs celebrated feminine wit, beauty, and resilience, indicating women's subtle but vital presence in these musical gatherings. As centuries passed, the tradition of medieval drinking songs evolved but left a lasting imprint on European folk music. Their influence can be heard in later ballads, sea shanties, and pub songs that continue to be sung today. These melodies remain a testament to the enduring human need for connection, expression, and shared joy amid life's uncertainties. To imagine a medieval evening with drinking songs is to step into a warm, crowded room where voices rise and fall like waves, where laughter mingles with music, and where the bonds of community are renewed with every verse. It is to hear the gentle slurring not as disorder, but as a symbol of release, a fleeting surrender to the moment's pleasure. Through these melodies, the medieval world speaks to us, not only about its drinking habits, but about its hopes, fears, and the timeless power of song to bring people together. The drinking song is a gentle reminder that even in the most challenging times, Humans have always found ways to celebrate life, share stories, and find comfort in one another's company. What to eat after too much ale. The morning after a night of revelry and ale was often met with more than just a dull headache or queasy stomach. For medieval drinkers, the consequences of overindulgence were a very real, embodied experience, a weight that settled heavily upon the body and mind. But what exactly did people eat and do to ease this morning after affliction? The medieval hangover, though lacking our modern medicines, was met with its own folk remedies, culinary rituals, and a practical wisdom passed down through generations. Unlike today, when hangover cures might include hydration, painkillers, or greasy breakfasts, medieval people relied on a blend of herbal knowledge, simple food, and time-honored practices rooted in the humoral theory of medicine. This ancient system, inherited from Greco-Roman traditions, framed health as a balance of bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Excess alcohol was thought to disrupt this balance, generating an overabundance of heat and moisture that manifested as headache, nausea, and fatigue. To counteract these effects, medieval texts and household manuals recommended foods and drinks designed to restore equilibrium. Light, easily digestible broths made from chicken or beef bones were often favored. These broths were believed to replenish lost fluids and provide gentle nourishment without taxing the stomach. The warmth of the broth soothed aching muscles and aided digestion, easing the discomfort caused by ale's harshness. Herbs also played a crucial role. Mint, sage, rosemary, and thyme were commonly brewed into teas or infused in warm water to calm the stomach and clear the head. The medicinal virtues of these plants were well known: mint for its cooling effect, rosemary to stimulate circulation, and sage for its cleansing properties. These herbal infusions were the medieval equivalent of modern-day hangover teas, offering both physical relief and mental comfort. In some regions, the hangover cure included the consumption of certain cheeses or dry bread soaked in vinegar or wine, believed to stimulate digestion and rebalance the humors. Porridge made from oats or barley was another staple, valued for its nourishing simplicity and ability to settle the stomach. The blandness of porridge contrasted sharply with the richness of ale, helping to ground the body after the night's excess. A lesser-known medieval practice involved the use of raw eggs, often mixed with wine or ale. This posset was thought to fortify the body with protein and warmth, helping to restore strength. While modern sensibilities might balk at the idea of raw eggs as a remedy, this was a common and trusted cure, embraced for its perceived restorative powers. Sleep itself was an essential component of recovery. Medieval medical advice often stressed rest as the ultimate cure for a hangover. Quiet, darkened rooms and gentle warmth from the hearth provided an environment for the body to cleanse itself and regain vitality. This emphasis on rest underscores how the physical toll of drinking was acknowledged as deeply taxing, not merely a social inconvenience. Interestingly, some medieval remedies advised against certain foods or drinks during hangovers. Spicy or overly rich foods were cautioned against, as were additional alcoholic beverages, contrary to the modern hair of the dog myth. Instead, moderation and simple, wholesome nourishment were emphasized to gently bring the body back into balance. The cultural context of the medieval hangover cure reveals much about the era's worldview. Food was medicine, and the act of eating after drinking was a deliberate, mindful ritual. It connected individuals not only to their own bodies, but to the rhythms of nature and the wisdom of tradition. Each bite, each sip of broth or herbal tea was part of a holistic approach to healing and self-care. For ordinary people, these remedies were practical and accessible. Most ingredients could be found in village gardens, local markets, or storerooms. The hangover cure was thus embedded in the fabric of daily life, part of an ongoing dialogue between humans, nature, and health. To imagine a medieval morning after drinking is to envision a slow, deliberate process of restoration. The warmth of broth rising from a humble bowl, the sharp aroma of fresh herbs steeping in water, and the quiet companionship of others who had also felt the weight of ale's excess. It was a moment of shared humanity, of vulnerability and care, set against a backdrop of earthy kitchens and smoky hearths. Ultimately, the medieval hangover cure was not just about relief from physical symptoms, it was about restoring balance to life itself. It reflected a world in which food and drink, health and habit, pleasure and consequence were deeply intertwined, reminding us that behind every ancient custom lies a profound understanding of the human condition. Children and ale. Why even kids drank it? In the quiet villages and bustling towns of medieval Europe, the sight of children with small wooden cups or modest tankards of ale was not unusual. It was commonplace. Today, the notion of children drinking any alcoholic beverage might shock or dismay, but in the medieval mindset, ale was not merely a recreational drink for adults. It was a vital part of everyday life, and children were no exception. To understand why even the youngest members of society drank ale, we must first step back and see the medieval world through its own eyes, a world profoundly shaped by practical needs, limited technology, and an understanding of health that differs greatly from modern perspectives. Clean water was often scarce or unsafe, polluted by human and animal waste, or stagnant and prone to breeding disease. The dangers of contaminated water were well known, even if their precise microbial causes were a mystery. Ale, on the other hand, was relatively safe to drink. The brewing process involved boiling water and fermenting grain, which naturally killed off many harmful pathogens. The resulting drink, though mildly alcoholic by today's standards, often ranging between 1 and 3% alcohol, served as a safer alternative to water. It was hydrating, nutritive, and contained calories, which made it an important source of sustenance, especially for children in growing bodies. In many households, it was common practice for infants to be given a weak, low-alcohol ale diluted with water, sometimes referred to as small beer. This brew was gentle enough for young stomachs and provided nourishment when breast milk was scarce or unavailable. It helped keep children hydrated and protected from waterborne illnesses that might otherwise cause deadly infections. Ale also fit into the broader framework of medieval nutrition and health, grounded in the humoral theory. A child's body, seen as warm and moist, needed balancing substances to stay healthy. Ale, with its warmth and mild bitterness, was thought to aid digestion and maintain that delicate internal balance. It was a drink believed to build strength and resilience. Socially, children drinking ale was part of a gradual initiation into the rhythms of communal life. In agrarian communities where work was shared among family members from a young age, ale was part of daily meals and celebrations. Sharing a cup of ale was a rite of belonging, a way to participate in the world of adults, even if in a tempered, supervised way. It connected children to the labor, customs, and social ties that defined medieval life. It is important to note, however, that the ale consumed by children was not the same strong brew that adults enjoyed in taverns or inns. The alcohol content was usually lower and the quantity smaller, more akin to a medicinal tonic than a beverage to intoxicate. Mothers, caregivers, and village alewives took care to ensure the ale given to children was safe and appropriate. Despite this, the idea of children drinking ale was not without its critics, even in medieval times. Some religious authorities and moralists worried about the effects of alcohol on young minds and bodies. Yet these concerns were often balanced against the harsh realities of life, where survival and practical health considerations outweighed abstract notions of temperance. The role of ale in children's lives also reflected the deeply communal nature of medieval society. Brewing and drinking ale were often household and village affairs. Mothers brewed small batches at home, passing knowledge and recipes from generation to generation. Children might watch and help with the brewing process, learning skills vital for their future roles. This hands-on participation connected them not just to a beverage, but to a tradition that was part of their cultural identity. Medieval artwork and literature occasionally depict children with mugs or cups, underscoring the normalization of the practice. These images reveal a world where ale was woven into the fabric of daily life, crossing the boundaries of age and class. Whether in a noble household or a peasant's cottage, ale was a shared, sustaining drink. The consumption of ale by children also highlights a significant difference in attitudes toward alcohol across time. In medieval Europe, alcohol was seen less as a stimulant or intoxicant and more as a basic foodstuff, essential for survival and health. This contrasts with modern views, shaped by scientific understanding and social norms, which strictly regulate alcohol consumption by age. Reflecting on children drinking ale in the medieval period invites us to reconsider assumptions about childhood, health, and culture. It reminds us that the past was governed by different needs and realities, where what seems strange today was once an everyday necessity. It also speaks to the adaptability and resilience of human communities who navigated a harsh world with practical wisdom. As we imagine a medieval child taking a sip of weak ale, perhaps beside a hearth in a smoky kitchen or in a sunlit village square, we glimpse a moment of connection, nourishment, and survival. This simple act carries echoes of a time when family, tradition, and the rhythms of daily life shaped every choice, even the choice of what a child drank. Ale was more than a drink. It was a symbol of life's continuance, a humble sustenance, and a thread in the vast tapestry of medieval society. And in this, the story of children and ale reveals a profound truth about humanity's enduring search for balance, health, and belonging in a world that was both challenging and beautiful. Tavern games and drinking dice. In the warm, dimly lit rooms of medieval taverns and inns, where the thick smoke of wood fires mingled with the hearty laughter of patrons, the culture of drinking was inseparable from the pleasures of play and social connection. These were not simply places to quench thirst. They were vital centers of community life, where stories were exchanged, deals were struck, and friendships forged over shared cups of ale. Among the many ways the medieval drinkers entertained themselves, games, particularly those involving dice, held a special place, blending chance, skill, and drinking into an experience that was as much about camaraderie as about competition. The origins of dice games stretch far back into antiquity, and by the medieval period, they were well established as a favored pastime across Europe. Dice, small cubes or rounded shapes marked with dots, were affordable, portable, and perfect for a tavern's crowded tables. Their appeal was simple. A roll could determine fate, fortune, or a night's merriment. But in the world of medieval drinking, dice were more than mere toys. They were instruments of ritual and social play that could both bond and divide. Tavern games involving dice were frequently intertwined with drinking challenges. The basic principle was straightforward. A player would roll the dice, and based on the result, either drink themselves or compel another to drink. Sometimes the stakes were higher, with tokens, coins, or even food wagered alongside cups of ale or wine. These games could enliven an evening, turning routine drinking into a lively, interactive spectacle. Among the popular variations was the game of Hazard, a complex dice game that can be seen as an ancestor of modern craps. Players would bet on the outcome of dice rolls, often involving multiple rounds and elaborate rules. The excitement of the game, combined with the unpredictability of the dice, created a charged atmosphere where fortunes could be won or lost, and drinking flowed freely. But beyond the surface fun, these dice games served deeper social functions. In medieval society, where daily life was often harsh and hierarchical, tavern games offered moments of escape and equality. For a time, the social distinctions of rank and class could blur around the dice table. Nobles, merchants, artisans, and laborers might all gather, united by chance and drink. The randomness of dice could level the playing field, reminding everyone of the capriciousness of fate, a humbling and often welcome truth. Dice games also reinforce trust and social bonds. To participate in a drinking game, one had to enter a shared space of risk and reward. The rules had to be understood and respected, the outcomes accepted without dispute. The communal laughter, teasing, and even friendly rivalry built connections that extended beyond the tavern walls into the wider community. Moreover, these games were frequently accompanied by songs, chants, and storytelling, further enriching the sensory and emotional experience of the evening. The dice clattered on wooden tables, mingling with the crackling fire and the hum of conversation. Players shouted encouragement or groaned at unlucky rolls, while others raised their mugs in solidarity or playful protest. These moments of collective joy and tension wove tavern games deeply into the fabric of medieval social life. It is also worth noting the role of tavern keepers and alewives in overseeing these games. While the games brought life and profit to their establishments, they also had to be carefully managed to avoid disputes or disorder. Some taverns had informal rules about acceptable wagers or the duration of games, reflecting an early form of social regulation. In some cases, local authorities kept a wary eye on tavern gaming, concerned about gambling excesses or the potential for unrest. The physical dice themselves varied in material and quality. Common dice were made from bone, wood, or ivory, often hand-carved with uneven dots that added an extra layer of unpredictability. Some were ornate, prized possessions carried by seasoned gamblers, while others were simple and worn, reflecting the humble origins of many players. The tactile feel of the dice, the anticipation as they rolled and tumbled, was as much part of the experience as the outcome. In the broader cultural context, the imagery and symbolism surrounding dice and gambling permeated medieval art and literature. Dice were sometimes portrayed as emblems of fortune's fickleness, used metaphorically to explore themes of destiny, sin, and morality. The tension between chance and choice, luck and skill, was a powerful narrative that resonated with medieval audiences and found echoes in the lively atmosphere of the tavern. Reflecting on these games today, it is striking how they encapsulate the human desire to find joy, connection, and meaning even in the humblest settings. The dice games of medieval taverns were not merely about drinking or gambling. They were about forging community, negotiating risk, and embracing life's uncertainties with laughter and companionship. So, as we imagine the flickering candlelight illuminating a circle of faces around a rough wooden table, the clatter of dice rolling, the warm glow of ale cups raised in challenge and cheer, we step into a timeless scene of human interaction. It is a scene that reminds us that across centuries and cultures, people have always sought ways to turn simple moments into shared memories, to face the randomness of life with playful hearts, and to celebrate the bonds that hold us together. Silent nights and sour brews inside the medieval alehouse. Opening scene, twilight falling over a medieval village. As twilight deepened, and the last of the day's light faded beyond the mullioned windows, the medieval alehouse transformed from a bustling hub of laughter and clatter into a place of quiet repose. Unlike the modern pub or bar, these inns and taverns often served as both drinking establishments and lodging for travelers and locals alike. Cut to flickering firelight, dim interior, people settling in. When the ale cups were drained and the singing stilled, the alehouse took on a different rhythm, one marked by the gentle crackle, certainly. Below is the entire text you provided, copied and pasted in full, exactly as requested, with nothing removed or altered, and ready for documentary use. Silent nights in the alehouse, fires, snoring, and stories. As twilight deepened and the last of the day's light faded beyond the mullioned windows, the medieval alehouse transformed from a bustling hub of laughter and clatter into a place of quiet repose. Unlike the modern pub or bar, these inns and taverns often served as both drinking establishments and lodging for travelers and locals alike. When the ale cups were drained and the singing stilled, the alehouse took on a different rhythm, one marked by the gentle crackle of fires, the muffled sounds of snoring, and the whispered exchange of stories lingering like a soft echo in the cool night air. The alehouse was a refuge from the cold, damp nights that were common across medieval Europe. Without modern heating, the fire's warmth was not just comfort but a necessity. Large hearths dominated the main rooms, their flames casting flickering shadows on stone walls, revealing the weary faces of patrons settled in for the night. The smoke, thick and pungent, mixed with the lingering aromas of ale, wood smoke, and sometimes the faint scent of unwashed bodies, a reminder of the many souls who had passed through. Sleeping arrangements in these communal spaces were rudimentary by today's standards. Long benches lined the walls, rough straw mattresses might be laid upon the floor, and sometimes simple wooden beds were available for those who could afford them. It was common for patrons to rest side by side, their bodies a tangled mosaic of limbs and blankets, creating a warmth that staved off the chill. The close quarters encouraged an intimacy and a shared humanity that softened the harshness of medieval life. Amid this scene of quiet slumber, the sounds of the alehouse nights became part of its character. Snoring, grunts, and the occasional cough punctuated the stillness, each adding a human texture to the darkness. The rhythmic breathing of many combined into a low, collective hum, a lullaby of sorts for the weary and the restless. Sometimes, a drunken mumble or a whispered tale would slip through the night, a last thread of connection before sleep took hold. Stories were the alehouse's soul, and even as eyes closed, they often lingered in hushed tones. Old men recounted battles, youthful travelers shared tales of distant lands, and villagers remembered legends of saints, monsters, and miracles. These stories, passed down orally, shaped the communal memory, weaving past and present into a shared cultural fabric. The alehouse was a cradle for oral tradition, a place where history was lived, not just learned. The night also offered a moment of reflection for those who had come to drink away the hardships of daily toil. The silence between the sounds, the crackling fire, the soft snoring, the gentle murmur of stories, created a contemplative atmosphere. It was in these quiet hours that many wrestled with thoughts of fate, faith, and fortune, contemplating the uncertain world beyond the alehouse walls. Safety was a concern in these communal sleeping spaces. While the alehouse offered shelter, it was no fortress. Guards or locks were rare, and patrons had to rely on the honor system and the watchful eyes of the innkeeper. Theft and quarrels could still erupt, especially if alcohol had flowed freely, but generally there was a mutual respect fostered by the shared need for rest and warmth. The alehouse fire itself was a symbol of life and continuity. Kept burning through the night, it warded off the cold and the darkness, both literal and metaphorical. It was a beacon for the tired traveler and a hearth for the community's heart. The rituals surrounding tending the fire, from the kindling of embers to the care of logs, were often entrusted to the innkeeper or a designated firekeeper, who ensured its steady glow. As the dawn approached, the alehouse slowly stirred back to life. The first light filtered through narrow windows, revealing the disheveled forms of sleepers rousing to face a new day. Groans and yawns filled the air, mingling with the faint aroma of porridge or morning ale. Outside, the village or town began its daily bustle anew, but within the alehouse, the memories of the night, the warmth, the stories, the shared humanity, lingered as a gentle reminder of the comfort found in companionship, even amid the unpredictability of medieval life. In these silent nights, we glimpse the rhythms of a time when community was crafted not just in daylight labor, but in the quiet, often unseen moments that bound people together. The alehouse was more than a place to drink. It was a sanctuary where life's burdens eased, stories lived on, and the simplest human needs, warmth, rest, and connection, were met under a common roof. What could go wrong? In the medieval world, brewing ale was as much an art as it was a gamble. Without the scientific tools and sanitary standards we take for granted today, every batch was a fragile dance between nature and nurture, often teetering on the edge of disaster. The humble ale, which flowed like the lifeblood of towns and villages alike, could easily turn sour, spoiled, or downright dangerous. Yet, despite these risks, it remained an indispensable part of daily life. The process of brewing ale was inherently unpredictable. From the selection of malted grains and the water source to the timing of fermentation, countless variables affected the final product. Medieval brewers relied on experience, instinct, and the wisdom passed down through generations. Still, there was no guarantee that the ale would turn out as intended. Spoilage was common, and the causes could be mysterious and bewildering. One of the chief culprits behind sour or spoiled ale was contamination by wild yeasts and bacteria. Unlike modern brewers who use carefully cultivated strains of yeast, medieval ale makers depended on wild yeast carried in the air or clinging to the surfaces of wooden barrels and brewing vessels. This natural fermentation could yield delightful flavors, or it could produce a harsh, sour, or unpleasant brew. Sometimes the ale developed a vinegar-like tang that repelled rather than refreshed, and at other times, strange off-putting odors would warn drinkers of impending misery. Rinsing or charring the barrels with fire to try and keep them clean. Even so, spoilage remained a persistent threat. The risks of drinking sour or spoiled ale extended beyond mere displeasure. Contaminated brews could cause stomach upsets, nausea, and diarrhea, ailments unwelcome in an age when medical knowledge was rudimentary and infections could easily turn fatal. On the other hand, the acidity of sour ale might have killed some harmful microbes, making it safer than water in many cases. The line between safe and unsafe drinks was often blurred, leaving medieval people to trust their senses. A sharp smell, odd taste, or cloudy appearance were warnings to avoid a particular batch. Despite the dangers, sour ale was not always rejected outright. In some regions, intentionally sour or stock ales were prized for their unique flavors and preserving qualities. Brewers learned to harness wild yeasts and bacterial cultures to create ales with a tart complexity that could improve with age. These sour brews sometimes became sought-after delicacies, their production a specialized craft passed from one alewife or brewer to another. The problem of spoiled ale was closely linked to the climate and seasons. Hot summers could accelerate fermentation and spoilage, while cooler autumn and winter months often yielded better results. Brewers paid close attention to these natural cycles, timing their brewing accordingly. The ale that survived through the winter might become more potent and flavorful, cherished as a seasonal treasure. Adding herbs and spices to ale was another medieval strategy to mask or prevent spoilage. Ingredients like rosemary, juniper berries, and ginger were sometimes added not only for flavor, but also for their antimicrobial properties. These botanical additions could extend the shelf life of ale or at least cover up slight imperfections. The tradition of spiced ales laid the groundwork for later developments such as spiced beers and holiday brews. Economic pressures also influenced the quality of ale. Brewers undercut by demand or cost might skimp on ingredients or cut corners in sanitation. Unscrupulous tavern keepers sometimes diluted ale with water or reused spoiled batches, risking customer health to save money. Public authorities periodically attempted to regulate brewing standards and punish adulteration, but enforcement was uneven and corruption common. For the medieval drinker, trusting one's palate was a crucial survival skill. Ale that smelled or tasted sour, bitter, or off was often avoided, but in times of scarcity, any drinkable liquid was precious. Anecdotes from chronicles and records reveal how people cope with poor quality brews, sometimes turning them into vinegar for preserving foods or even resorting to strange folk remedies to counteract the ill effects of bad ale. Ultimately, the story of sour and spoiled ale is a tale of resilience and adaptation. Medieval people navigated the uncertainties of fermentation with a blend of knowledge, tradition, and pragmatism. They developed tastes that embraced the quirks of their brews, celebrated the successes, and endured the failures. Their relationship with ale was not merely about intoxication, but about survival, community, and the shared rituals that shaped their world. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval tavern, the glass of ale before you might have carried within it the breath of wild yeast, the taste of the earth and grain, and the unpredictable hand of time. Each sip was a journey through history, a reminder of the delicate balance between nature's gifts and human ingenuity, and sometimes a small gamble with fate itself. Noble feasts and bottomless goblets. In the glittering halls of medieval castles and noble estates, drinking was not merely a casual affair, but a grand ritual woven into the very fabric of power, prestige, and social hierarchy. Noble feasts were occasions of elaborate ceremony, where the clinking of goblets and the flowing of wine and ale punctuated lavish displays of wealth and influence. Unlike the modest, practical drinking habits of peasants and townsfolk, the aristocracy indulged in the pleasures of endless cups and bottomless goblets, a spectacle both dazzling and deeply symbolic. These feasts were central to medieval noble life, serving multiple purposes beyond mere sustenance. They were stages upon which alliances were forged, disputes settled, and reputations crafted. Lords and ladies gathered in ornate great halls, surrounded by tapestries depicting heroic deeds and biblical tales, their tables laden with roasted meats, exotic spices, and piles of fresh bread. At the heart of this sensory extravaganza was the abundant flow of drink, often wine imported from southern vineyards, imported spices infused into meads, and locally brewed ales of the highest quality. The noble drinking culture was distinguished by its sheer excess and variety. Goblets and cups were crafted from precious metals, intricately decorated with enamel and jewels. These vessels were often passed hand to hand in elaborate toasts that could last hours. The concept of a bottomless goblet wasn't merely a metaphor. Servants continually refilled cups, ensuring that the noble guests never lacked their drink. This ceaseless flow of alcohol was a statement of generosity, wealth, and hospitality, demonstrating that the host had the resources to satisfy every desire. Drinking at noble feasts was a highly social and performative act. Toasts were delivered with great ceremony, often invoking saints, ancestors, or the health of the monarch. Drinking songs and poetry enlivened the atmosphere, and jesters or minstrels entertained the assembly. The raising of a goblet was a call to camaraderie and loyalty, a ritual binding the guests in shared celebration and political unity. Yet beneath the surface of this gaiety lay a complex relationship with alcohol. Noble drinking could be both liberating and dangerous. Excess was often encouraged, as it loosened tongues and fostered bonds, but it also led to drunkenness that could cause embarrassment, conflict, or worse. Chronicles from the period occasionally recount scenes of drunken brawls among the aristocracy, or nobles losing favor through imprudent speech made beneath the influence of too many goblets. Health beliefs of the time also shaped drinking habits. Medieval medicine was rooted in the humoral theory, which linked bodily health to the balance of four humors. Wine and ale were thought to affect these humors differently, influencing temperament and vitality. Some nobles drank specific types of wine for medicinal reasons, while others believed that certain drinks could stave off illness or prolong youth. These notions infused drinking with an almost mystical importance, elevating it beyond mere indulgence. The wines favored at noble feasts varied depending on region and status. French wines from Bordeaux and Burgundy were prized, but Italian and Spanish varieties also found their way onto noble tables. The taste of these imported wines, unfamiliar to many, was sometimes mixed with spices, honey, or even herbs to suit medieval palates. This practice of spicing wine would later evolve into the tradition of mulled wine or wassail. Ale remained a staple even among the nobility, though their brews were often stronger, clearer, and more carefully crafted than common versions. Monasteries, which brewed some of the finest ales, supplied noble patrons, blending tradition with quality. The exchange between religious institutions and noble houses helped maintain the high standards expected at feasts. The logistics of supplying such copious amounts of drink were enormous. Estates maintained large cellars stocked with barrels of ale, casks of wine, and jars of mead. Specialized servants were tasked with managing these supplies, pouring for guests, and ensuring no goblet ran dry. This behind-the-scenes orchestration was crucial to the success of the feast and the reputation of the host. In moments of intimate conversation away from the public eye, nobles might sip from private flasks or small cups, savoring rare vintages or homemade concoctions. These quieter rituals contrasted sharply with the boisterous communal drinking at the main tables, offering a glimpse into the personal tastes and subtleties of aristocratic life. Noble drinking culture also played a part in diplomacy. Feasts could last for days during visits from foreign dignitaries or royal courts, with every toast carrying political weight. The shared experience of drinking fostered a fragile camaraderie, bridging differences in language, culture, and politics. Yet it was also a battleground for status, where the ability to drink deeply without losing composure was a mark of strength and honor. Despite the splendor and ceremony, noble drinking was not immune to criticism. Moralists and clergy often condemned excessive indulgence, warning of the sins of drunkenness and urging moderation. Sermons and writings from the period reveal a tension between the joys of feasting and the Christian ideals of temperance and self-control. In sum, the bottomless goblets of medieval noble feasts tell a story of complexity, of joy and danger, power and vulnerability, tradition and excess. They reveal a world where drink was more than refreshment. It was a language of social order, a symbol of identity, and a force shaping relationships both personal and political. To imagine a medieval noble feast is to picture a brilliant tapestry of human experience, shimmering with the clink of goblets and the warmth of shared celebration, a world at once distant and deeply human. Drunken justice. When the reeve got rowdy, in the intricate tapestry of medieval village life, the reeve stood as a vital figure, the local official responsible for overseeing the lord's estate, collecting rents, and maintaining order among the peasants. Yet beneath the weighty responsibilities of his office, the reeve was a man subject to the same human frailties as those he governed. One such frailty was alcohol, a constant companion in medieval life, and sometimes a source of disorder rather than peace. The phrase drunken justice aptly captures the curious and often chaotic intersection of law and libation in the Middle Ages, where the reeve's judgment could be clouded by a cup too many, and the very order he was meant to uphold teetered on the brink of rowdiness. Justice in medieval villages was less about cold, impartial rulings and more about a delicate balance of power, social expectations, and local customs. The reeve, often elected by the villagers themselves or appointed by the lord, walked a fine line between authority and neighbor. His duties included presiding over the manorial court, a place where disputes over land, labor, and minor crimes were settled. Yet these courts were not always solemn chambers of law. They were frequently gatherings infused with the same social dynamics and convivial spirit that permeated village life. Alcohol was a fixture at these manorial gatherings. Ale or wine was commonly served to attendees, including the reeve, jurors, and villagers. A shared cup was part ritual, part social lubricant, easing tensions and fostering a sense of community. However, this tradition could easily tip into excess. Historical records and chronicles tell of reeves who, after a few tankards, became less a figure of sober justice and more a boisterous presence, their ruling swayed by the warmth and courage bestowed by drink. When the reeve grew rowdy, the manorial court transformed from a place of order into one of spirited debate and sometimes outright chaos. Villagers might mock or challenge the reeve's decisions, emboldened by the loosened tongues and laughter that alcohol inspired. Stories survive of heated arguments erupting over petty grievances, where punches might be thrown and tempers flared. In such moments, the reeve's authority was tested not by law, but by his ability to hold his own in a tavern-like atmosphere. Yet despite the disorder that drunkenness could cause, it was often accepted as part of the social fabric. The reeve was not expected to be a detached magistrate, but a man of the village, fallible, human, and occasionally tipsy. His ability to dispense justice while navigating the boisterous environment was seen as a skill as much as a duty. Indeed, some villagers trusted the reeve's judgment more when he had shared a drink with them, believing that the common experience created empathy and understanding. The tension between justice and alcohol also reflects broader medieval attitudes toward drinking. Alcohol was not merely a pleasure or a vice. It was woven into the rhythms of daily life, work, and ritual. Alehouses and taverns were extensions of the public square, places where social bonds were forged and community decisions often made informally. The Reeves' participation in this culture underscored the porous boundaries between official roles and communal life. At times, the Reeves' rowdiness could escalate into serious problems. Drunkenness might lead to partiality, harsh punishments, or abuse of power. Lords and higher officials occasionally intervened, reminding Reeves of their responsibilities or even replacing those deemed unfit due to excessive drinking. Yet even these admonitions acknowledge the challenge of balancing authority with the convivial customs that defined village life. Interestingly, the Reeves' drinking was also tied to seasonal rhythms and festivals. Feasts, market days, and religious holidays provided occasions for communal celebration, where the Reeve, like all villagers, joined in the revelry. These events offered a sanctioned release from everyday duties, and drinking to excess was often tolerated as a temporary break from the strictures of justice. The image of the Reeve, goblet in hand, navigating the fine line between law and laughter, reveals much about medieval society's complexity. Justice was not detached or cold, but deeply embedded in a web of personal relationships, local customs, and shared experiences, including those born of the cup. This blending of roles reminds us that history is not only about institutions and rules, but about people and their imperfect, sometimes amusing, sometimes troubling humanity. Thus, drunken justice was more than a phrase. It was a lived reality in medieval villages, a reminder that even those entrusted with the law were shaped by the social and cultural context in which they lived. The Reeves' rowdiness was a symbol of the vibrant, messy, and deeply human nature of medieval justice, a justice that could be firm, fair, and flawed, all in the same breath. Midnight confessions and candlelit cups. As darkness blanketed the medieval village, and the flickering light of candles danced softly against timbered walls, another kind of ritual began, one wrapped in secrecy, reflection, and the quiet clink of pewter cups. Midnight confessions, paired with candlelit drinks, were an intimate, almost sacred aspect of medieval drinking culture, revealing a world where alcohol, faith, and human vulnerability intertwined in unexpected ways. The night was a time when the burdens of the day faded into shadows, yet the mind often stirred with memories, regrets, and hopes. Villagers, weary from their labor yet unable to sleep, found solace in small gatherings around hearths or in hidden corners of inns. These were moments far removed from the bustling noise of the day, quieter, more introspective, where whispered words mingled with the gentle sip of ale or wine. Confession in medieval society was not confined to the confessional booth of the church. While formal confession was a sacred sacrament, there existed a more informal practice among friends and neighbors. In the glow of candlelight, people shared not only their stories and secrets, but sometimes their confessions, admissions of mistakes, transgressions, or hidden fears, seeking comfort or absolution in the presence of trusted companions. The drink served as a gentle companion in these vulnerable exchanges, loosening tongues and softening hearts. The candlelight was symbolic, its fragile glow a reminder of both the transience of life and the hope of redemption. The flickering flames illuminated faces marked by toil and worry, eyes glistening with the weight of unspoken thoughts. In this setting, the communal sharing of cups became a ritual of connection, a brief sanctuary from the harsh realities of medieval existence. Alcohol's role in these midnight moments was complex. It was at once a balm and a catalyst. A small cup of spiced wine or strong ale could ease anxieties, allowing villagers to voice their fears or regrets that daylight might have silenced. Yet the same drink carried risks. Overindulgence in the quiet hours sometimes led to unrest, arguments, or whispered rumors that spread like wildfire by morning. These candlelit cups were also intertwined with medieval beliefs about the soul, sin, and salvation. Drinking late at night could be seen as a temptation or even a sin itself. Yet when coupled with confession, it became part of a delicate dance between penitence and pleasure. The lines between sacred and profane blurred, revealing a humanity that balanced faith with the simple need for companionship and release. Priests, monks, and other religious figures often counseled moderation, cautioning that the devil lurked in excess and that the soul's health was paramount. Yet even they recognized the power of communal sharing, of ritual drinking in small, measured quantities as part of social and spiritual life. Some monasteries kept wine for evening prayers and fellowship, underscoring that the sacred and the social were never far apart. In homes and inns, these late-night gatherings forged bonds of trust and empathy. Villagers who might have clashed over land or labor by day found themselves united in their shared confessions and candlelit cups by night. Stories of hardship, loss, and fleeting joy were exchanged with a tenderness seldom seen in daylight, painting a fuller picture of medieval community life, one where survival was not just physical but emotional and spiritual. The midnight confession was not always solemn. Laughter and tears mixed freely, and songs or poems might be recited, weaving moments of beauty into the dark hours. The drink, far from merely dulling senses, could inspire creativity and openness, allowing hidden facets of character to emerge. It was a time when the human spirit, weary yet resilient, found expression and connection. In reflecting on these candlelit rituals, we glimpse a medieval world that was far from austere or grim. Instead, it was vibrant, textured, and deeply human. A world where the flicker of a candle and the passing of a cup could bring light to the darkness, warmth to the cold, and companionship to the lonely. The midnight confessions and candlelit cups remind us that beneath the surface of history lie moments of tenderness, courage, and the enduring need for connection. As you close your eyes tonight, imagine the soft glow of candlelight, the murmur of whispered truths, and the gentle clink of cups shared in trust. Picture faces bathed in amber light, marked by the struggles of the day, but softened by the grace of the night. This is the quiet heart of medieval drinking habits, a testament to the enduring power of human connection, even in the darkest hours.
The Alewives trade, power brewing,
And quiet rebellion. In the tapestry of medieval life, the figure of the alewife stands out with a quiet yet profound significance. Behind the bubbling cauldrons and fragrant brews, alewives wielded a subtle power that extended far beyond the mere craft of fermentation. They were custodians of a vital tradition, skilled artisans whose brews sustained villages, nurtured communities, and, in their own way, challenged social conventions and hierarchies. This segment invites you into the world of the alewife, a woman who brewed not only ale, but also a form of quiet rebellion and influence in a male-dominated society. Alewives were often women who brewed ale within their homes, mixing barley, water, and sometimes herbs or spices in wooden vats that simmered over hearth fires. Their craft was passed down through generations, each brew carrying the imprint of ancestral knowledge and local flavor. The alewife's trade was more than a mere household chore. It was an essential economic and social activity that kept the village hearths warm and the spirits high. Brewing was a delicate art that required attention to timing, temperature, and ingredients, skills that alewives mastered without written manuals or formal training. They controlled the quality and quantity of ale, deciding when the brew was ready and how it would be shared. In a world where clean water was scarce and often dangerous, ale provided a safer, nourishing alternative. It was a daily staple, consumed by young and old alike, and the alewife was its keeper. Yet the alewife's role was not without complexity. In a society where women's roles were largely confined to the domestic sphere, brewing was a domain in which women held undeniable expertise and influence. Alewives occupied a unique position in the social hierarchy, respected for their craft, relied upon by their neighbors, yet often viewed with suspicion by authorities and sometimes even by their communities. The intoxicating power of ale was feared and regulated, and alewives faced accusations ranging from negligence to witchcraft, especially when brews soured or when disputes arose. Despite such challenges, many alewives navigated this precarious balance with resilience. Their trade gave them a form of economic independence rare for medieval women. They could barter ale for goods, extend credit, and forged networks of trust that connected families and villages. In many ways, the alewife was a linchpin of community cohesion, a figure who understood the rhythms of rural life and the needs of her neighbors. This trade also embodied a quiet rebellion against the rigid social order. By mastering a craft that required knowledge, skill, and entrepreneurial savvy, alewives asserted a form of agency that subtly challenged gender norms. They brewed not only ale, but social capital, crafting relationships and wielding influence behind the scenes of daily life. Their kitchens and brewhouses were spaces where women exercised power, sometimes openly, sometimes discreetly, but always effectively. The alewife's trade intertwined with broader cultural and economic currents. As towns grew and markets expanded, some alewives moved from home-based brewing to running inns or taverns, where their products reached a wider audience. This transition brought new opportunities and risks. Inns became hubs of social life, places where stories, news, and gossip flowed as freely as the ale. Alewives who managed these establishments took on roles as businesswomen, mediators, and even local celebrities. The laws surrounding ale production reflected the alewife's importance and the anxiety her trade could provoke. Municipal regulations often imposed strict controls on brewing, quality, and prices. Alewives had to navigate these legal frameworks carefully, ensuring their products met standards while protecting their livelihoods. Violations could lead to fines or loss of license, but skilled alewives learned to balance compliance with subtle negotiation. Beyond economics and law, the alewife's trade was deeply woven into the social fabric of medieval life. Ale was present at births and funerals, festivals, and daily meals, marking the passage of time and the cycles of life. The alewife, as the source of this vital drink, was a witness to joy, sorrow, celebration, and hardship. Her brew was a companion in moments of communal solidarity and personal reflection alike. In many ways, the story of the alewife is a story of medieval women's resilience and resourcefulness. It reveals how, within the constraints of their time, women found spaces to create, lead, and influence. The alewife's quiet rebellion was not marked by loud protests or grand gestures, but by the steady rhythm of boiling vats, measured pours, and shared cups. As you imagine the alewife stirring her brew by firelight, think of her not just as a brewer of ale, but as a keeper of tradition and a quiet force shaping medieval community life. Her craft was both a necessity and an art, a livelihood and a statement. In the bubbles rising to the surface of her vats, you glimpse a world where power was brewed quietly and influence flowed as freely as the ale itself. Imported wine and foreign spirits, the luxury of the upper class. In medieval Europe, while the common folk often started their days with ale and relied on home-brewed beverages, a different world of drink existed for the upper echelons of society, a world of imported wines and exotic spirits that symbolized status, wealth, and connection to far-off lands. This segment explores the nuanced role that these foreign drinks played in medieval aristocratic life, revealing a tale of luxury, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that contrasted sharply with the everyday cups of ale and mead shared in village taverns. Wine, particularly imported varieties from regions like France, Spain, and Italy, was a prized commodity among nobles and royalty. Unlike ale, which was ubiquitous and practical, wine was a marker of refinement and power. The vineyards of Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Mediterranean coast supplied barrels and casks that journeyed across land and sea to grace the tables of castles and manors. To drink imported wine was to participate in a social ritual that underscored one's place in the medieval hierarchy. These imported wines were not only beverages, but also vehicles of political and economic significance. The acquisition and display of fine wine demonstrated a lord's connections to trade networks and diplomatic channels. Hosting lavish banquets with foreign wine elevated the prestige of the host and reinforced alliances among noble families. In this way, wine became entwined with the art of medieval politics, where every sip carried layers of meaning beyond mere refreshment. Foreign spirits, though less common than wine, were also part of this luxurious drinking culture. Distilled liquors from the Mediterranean and Middle East began to make their way into Europe through merchants and crusaders, introducing new flavors and intoxicating possibilities. These spirits, often made from herbs and spices, were sometimes consumed for medicinal purposes, but they also became a symbol of exotic sophistication. Their rarity and expense placed them squarely in the realm of the elite. The upper classes' consumption of imported wine and spirits was governed by intricate customs and etiquette. Drinking was a highly ritualized affair, with elaborate vessels, goblets of silver, gold, or finely crafted glass, passed around in carefully choreographed sequences. Toasts and blessings punctuated the flow of wine, reinforcing social bonds and expressing loyalty, gratitude, or even veiled political messages. The careful handling of such precious libations reflected the weight of tradition and status. Wine cellars in castles were sites of great importance and careful management. Stewardship of these cellars was a trusted responsibility, often held by the seneschal or a dedicated cellarer, who ensured the proper storage and preservation of vintages that might be years old. The climate of medieval Europe was less predictable than today, making the art of wine preservation an evolving challenge that required knowledge and skill. A well-stocked cellar was both a symbol of wealth and a practical necessity for hosting guests and sustaining noble households through harsh seasons. The sourcing of these wines was itself an endeavor fraught with challenges. Transporting fragile barrels across rough roads and turbulent seas risked spoilage, and tariffs or conflicts could interrupt supply. Yet the demand for imported wines remained strong, fueled by noble taste and the allure of the distant. This demand in turn stimulated trade routes that linked medieval Europe with the broader world, creating channels for goods, ideas, and cultures to intermingle. The contrast between the drinking habits of the upper class and those of the common people was stark. While peasants and townsfolk might raise mugs of ale brewed nearby, the nobility sipped wines with notes of grape varieties they might never see in their fields. This divide underscored the broader social stratifications of medieval society, where luxury and necessity coexisted uneasily, and where access to certain pleasures was tightly controlled by wealth and birth. Yet, this luxurious consumption was not merely indulgence. It was deeply embedded in the identity and culture of the medieval elite. Wine was woven into religious ceremonies, feasts, and rites of passage, from coronations to marriages. Its presence signified not only earthly wealth, but also divine favor and legitimacy. The biblical references to wine as a symbol of joy and blessing further enhanced its cultural cachet among Christian rulers. The appreciation of imported wine also gave rise to a burgeoning culture of connoisseurship among the medieval aristocracy. Tasting notes, preferences, and vintages became topics of discussion and debate in courtly circles. Some noble households even maintained written records of their cellars, cataloging vintages and noting the qualities of various batches, a precursor to modern wine journals. As you imagine the clinking of goblets and the rich aromas wafting through candlelit halls, picture a world where wine and foreign spirits were more than drinks. They were instruments of identity, diplomacy, and power. The luxury of the upper class was sipped slowly, with reverence and ceremony, in a dance of taste and tradition that connected medieval Europe to the wider medieval world. In this light, imported wine and spirits were not simply indulgences, but symbols of a complex social fabric, an intricate interplay of economics, culture, and politics, revealing a medieval world as global and interconnected as any we might imagine today. Fasting, drinking, and holy loopholes. In a world governed as much by sacred calendar as by crop cycles, medieval life was punctuated by fasts, holy periods in which eating habits were transformed into acts of devotion. For the deeply faithful, these were times to tame the body and lift the spirit. But what happens when a society that drinks ale like water suddenly must go without? The answer lies in the curious intersection of piety and practicality, a world where drinking didn't just survive fasting, it thrived through it, thanks to a tangle of holy loopholes and spiritual improvisation. Fasting in the medieval Christian calendar was serious business. Lent alone spanned 40 days, not to mention countless vigils, saint days, and the ember days that scattered themselves across the year. On these days, meat was forbidden, and in stricter interpretations, so was dairy, oil, and even eggs. But while the table grew sparse, the cup often remained full, especially if that cup contained something brewed. Because when rules tightened, people found clever ways to bend them without breaking. One of the most fascinating realities of medieval fasting was the categorization of liquids. Water, though considered pure, was often unsafe to drink. Ale and weak beer, on the other hand, were ubiquitous, mild in alcohol, and boiled during brewing, making them safer for consumption. It was widely accepted that these beverages, even though technically fermented, were liquid food. And liquid food, according to many clerical interpretations, didn't necessarily count as breaking the fast. Thus, during fasts, ale, especially thin, weak ale known as small beer, became not just common, but essential. This logic extended even further into the monastic world, where fasting was strictest and most frequent. Monks, bound by rule and ritual, often engaged in multiple fasts each week. Yet monasteries were known not only for their discipline, but for their beer. These cloistered communities brewed their own ale, sometimes several varieties, and consumed it regularly, even during times of supposed abstinence. When challenged, they pointed to the nutritional content of beer, arguing that it sustained the body without indulging it. After all, drinking was not chewing, and thus the loophole held. Wine, too, found its place during fasts, particularly in wealthier monasteries and among the clergy. While excessive drunkenness was frowned upon, especially for those tasked with spiritual leadership, moderate consumption of wine was often permitted. The reasoning again lay in practicality. Wine, especially when diluted, was viewed as medicinal, warming, and purifying. In fasting periods, it was said to help the body maintain its strength and the soul maintain its focus. In moderation, wine was framed not as indulgence, but as aid. These beliefs were not without criticism. Some more austere sects, particularly early reformers and strict Cistercian orders, pushed back against what they saw as indulgent reasoning. To them, drinking during fasts diluted the very idea of sacrifice. They argued that the body could and should endure discomfort, that spiritual clarity came through restraint. But for the majority of medieval Europe, where life was already hard and food often scarce, finding theological space for a nourishing cup of ale was a small mercy in a difficult world. Outside the cloister, among the laity, the holy loopholes were even more creatively stretched. In some towns, thick soups and broths were blended into near-drinkable forms to qualify as liquid. In others, ale was steeped with bread, herbs, and eggs, pushing the boundaries of liquid consumption while technically staying within the fast limits. This wasn't done in rebellion, but in reverence mixed with realism. Fasting was never meant to kill the body. It was meant to humble it, to place it into context beneath the soul. If a person could still function, could still labor in the fields or pray in the chapel, while sipping a strong, warming brew, then surely God would understand. There's even evidence that, during certain religious fasts, monasteries produced richer, heartier ales specifically for those periods. Fast beer, in some regions, particularly among German-speaking monastics, was a type of dark, calorie-dense ale brewed not in defiance of the rules, but to live within them. It sustained monks through long stretches of limited solid food, carrying them from one divine office to the next. To brew was to survive, and to survive was, in their eyes, to continue glorifying God. In our modern world of carefully calibrated measurements and standardized bar pours, it's easy to take precision for granted. A pint is a pint, an ounce is an ounce. A bottle lists its volume in clean, legible numbers. But travel back to a smoky tavern in 14th century England, or a bustling alehouse in a German trading town, and you'd find yourself in a very different kind of reality. A world where how much you drank often depended on where you were, who was pouring, and whether the alewife liked you that day. Measuring a pint in the medieval world was as much about custom, negotiation, and local power as it was about liquid volume. The truth is, they didn't have a single pint. Not really. In fact, even the word pint could mean wildly different things depending on geography and the passage of time. There was the imperial pint, but that wouldn't even be codified until the 19th century. Before that, English measures included a confusing tangle of local systems: wine measure, ale measure, and even corn measure, each with its own standards, each jealously guarded by local customs officers and market reeves. In one town, a pint might be 16 fluid ounces. In another, it could be 20. And in a third, perhaps 24 or even more, depending on who made the mugs. Measuring vessels were rarely uniform. Pewter tankards, wooden mugs, and ceramic jugs came in all shapes and sizes, and few were stamped with any indication of volume. Instead, ale was often sold by trust, by reputation, or by the ladleful. A tavern might advertise ale by the gallon, but even a gallon wasn't a fixed concept. One tavern's gallon could be a full quart larger than another's. Buyers and sellers operated in a fog of tradition, where fairness was enforced less by weights and measures than by public scrutiny and the rare appearance of an ale conner, a kind of drink inspector tasked with ensuring the people weren't being cheated. Ale conners were appointed in many English towns, especially during market days and festivals, to walk from tavern to tavern with a simple toolkit: a spoon, a sample mug, and, most famously, a pair of leather trousers. Yes, leather trousers. Their method was unusual but effective. They would pour a sample of ale onto a bench or stool, sit in it for a few minutes, and then stand up. If their breeches stuck to the seat, the ale was deemed too sugary and thick, suggesting that the brewer had added sweeteners to disguise poor quality or low alcohol content. It wasn't an exact science. But in a time before thermometers, hydrometers, or measuring jugs, it worked well enough. But volume wasn't the only thing fuzzy about drinking in the medieval world. Even the idea of what constituted a serving could shift with social class. A nobleman's cup might be a goblet the size of a modern pitcher. A peasant's pot might hold less than today's teacup. In many homes, communal mugs were passed from hand to hand, filled and refilled as needed, without any thought to portion control. You drank until you felt good, or until the mug was taken away. The issue wasn't ignorance so much as priority. The medieval world was not obsessed with precise quantification in the way we are. Their daily lives were ruled more by sensory experience and collective memory than by numbers. A good pour was one that satisfied. A fair pour was one that didn't leave you feeling cheated. Volume mattered only when it became an issue, when someone was overcharging, under-delivering, or getting drunk too fast. Then, and only then, did people turn to the vague standards of local law. These legal measures were often kept in churches or market halls, heavy brass or iron pots known as standard measures. Local officials would occasionally bring them out to compare them to the mugs used in public houses. But the inspections were rare, and enforcement even rarer. Most people simply relied on the reputation of the inn or the honesty of the brewer. And in a small village, where everyone knew each other, fairness was less about law and more about communal trust. Still, disputes did arise. There are records of villagers taking alewives or tavern keepers to manorial court for short measure, essentially accusing them of cheating customers by using undersized mugs or deceptive practices. These trials were often more about maintaining social harmony than enforcing strict justice. A guilty verdict might result in a fine or a public shaming, but more often it was settled with an apology, a promise to reform, and perhaps a few free pints to the community. Justice, like measurement, was fluid. Last call, the quiet end of a long ale day. It's late. The fire in the hearth has burned low, its orange light flickering against the rough plaster of the tavern wall. Outside, the wind moves through empty streets, rustling straw, nudging shutters, and carrying the last echo of laughter into the darkness. Inside, only a few remain. The innkeeper polishing mugs in silence, a couple of villagers slumped over the long table, their breath slow, their bellies warm with ale. This is the end of a medieval drinking day. The slow, quiet descent after the rowdiness of the evening has burned away, and what's left is peace and sleep and maybe a murmured prayer. In a world where clocks did not tick out the hours and bars had no neon signs announcing last call, the closing of a tavern or alehouse was more a feeling than a rule. The day had its rhythms, and so did the drink. Farmers rose with the sun and drank ale with their morning bread. Laborers paused mid-morning for a lighter brew. By evening, the tavern filled with men in dirt-streaked tunics, women carrying news and gossip, children running underfoot, and travelers seeking a warm place to rest. But as darkness deepened, something changed. The mood slowed, voices lowered, the rowdy songs faded. Even the mug felt heavier in the hand. Last call in a medieval alehouse wasn't shouted. It wasn't enforced by law or barked by bouncers. Instead, it arrived like a natural consequence of human exhaustion. The candle burned low. The ale barrel neared empty. The innkeeper with quiet gestures might stop pouring, a nod to a regular, a slow wiping of the bench. The communal understanding settled over the room. The night was ending. Some stumbled out into the cold. Others stayed, heads resting on the table, allowed to nap before the walk home. In winter, it wasn't uncommon for guests to sleep by the fire, tucked under their cloaks like stray dogs beside the coals. These were communal spaces, not just for drinking, but for being. A tavern was a stage for life. During the day, it rang with argument, trade, singing, and sometimes fighting. But at night, it became a place of reflection, a kind of chapel of shared fatigue. Many innkeepers allowed regulars to linger, especially the old, the lonely, or the weary traveler. A few coins exchanged hands or not. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about the unwinding of the body, the dimming of the day. In larger towns, alehouses were supposed to close at a certain hour, especially during holy seasons or curfew hours. Authorities worried about drunken disorder, and rules were posted in city ordinances. But in practice, enforcement was inconsistent. As with much in medieval life, law gave way to custom, and custom gave way to community. If you were a known face, no one questioned you resting your head on the table for a while longer. If you were a stranger, you might be gently asked to leave or offered a blanket in the stable loft. There is something deeply human in that soft ending, something we forget in our rush to close tabs, finish shows, or meet deadlines. In the medieval world, endings were not abrupt. They were allowed to arrive naturally. People didn't need reminders to rest. Their bodies told them, the dim light told them, the silent mug told them, and they listened. Sometimes the innkeeper would whisper a few words to the last guests, not a warning, not a threat, just a gentle reminder that the fire would soon die and the morning would come fast. In those last moments, you might hear the creak of wood, the sigh of a tired worker, the gentle splash of a mug being rinsed for tomorrow, and then quiet, just the crackling of ash, just the knowing, shared by everyone in the room, that today had ended and tomorrow would begin, with another mug, perhaps, and another story. So next time you pour yourself a drink before bed, remember those medieval nights, not for their rowdy songs or chaotic feasts, but for their peace, for the way they let the night arrive gently, for the way even the loudest tavern knew when to be still.